"We don't tolerate your kindness here," Mrs. Whitmore sneered, loud enough for the entire classroom to hear. The silence that followed cracked like glass. The walls of Brentwood Academy were polished oak and cold marble, echoing with the history of generations of privilege that until today had remained mostly unchallenged. Jaden Carter stood in the center of it all, his navy blue blazer immaculate, his black shoes polished to a mirror shine. Around him, rows of perfect white faces gawked, shifting in their seats, uncertain whether to laugh or shrink. Outside the tall windows, the autumn leaves danced in slow spirals, oblivious to the ugliness blooming inside. Mrs. Whitmore, stern and sharp as a hawk, adjusted her designer scarf as if to ward off the presence of something distasteful. "People like you," she said, voice dripping with disdain, "should know their place." The humiliation rolled off her tongue casually, like an old habit. A few students snickered behind their textbooks. Most looked away, afraid, uncomfortable. The air felt heavier, thick with silent complicity. Jaden didn't flinch. Not even a blink. His backpack dangled loosely from his shoulder, and his fingers rested lightly against his side. Calm. Still. Inside, a storm brewed. Mrs. Whitmore stepped closer, clutching Jaden's ID badge between two manicured fingers. She yanked it from his blazer, letting it dangle mockingly. "Enrollment mistake," she said, raising her voice again. "Don't worry, we'll fix it." A few gasps echoed. Jaden lifted his chin slowly, his gaze steady, unshaken. His voice, when it came, was low but razor-sharp. "You should probably call the board," he said. A half-smile flickered across his lips, cool and lethal. "You'll want them to explain who paid for this new building you're standing in." The room froze. Even the leaves outside seemed to halt mid-fall. Mrs. Whitmore's hand faltered, just slightly. Her perfect posture stiffened, her jaw tightening. But it was too late. A seed of doubt, cold, alien, terrifying, had been planted. And Jaden Carter wasn't about to let it die. The hallway buzzed before first period even ended. It started small, a ripple through the crowd. But by the time Jaden exited Mrs. Whitmore's classroom, the entire sophomore wing felt charged, electric, with whispers. "Did you hear what she said? I heard he's connected to someone huge. Wait, his dad's rich or something?" Jaden walked calmly down the polished marble floors, each step echoing louder than the murmured gossip that trailed him. Students parted for him, subtle but clear, as if the air around him had shifted, made him something untouchable. He didn't look left, he didn't look right, he just walked, steady, composed, regal in a place that wanted him invisible. At her desk, Mrs. Whitmore seethed. Her carefully constructed facade, 30 years of authority, pedigree, and unchallenged supremacy, now felt like it was resting on broken glass. She gripped the edge of her desk tightly, watching Jaden's retreating back through the narrow glass slit of her door. "He'll learn," she muttered under her breath. "He'll learn." But already a splinter of unease twisted inside her chest. It wasn't just the way Jaden hadn't flinched. It was the way he had smiled. Cold, knowing, and worst of all, it was the unmistakable glint of pity in his eyes. When he looked at her, not anger, not fear, pity. Word reached the teacher's lounge before lunchtime. "Whitmore's in trouble. Kids, somebody important. I heard the Carter family built half this school." Mrs. Whitmore stormed into the lounge, her heels clicking sharply against the tile. Conversations died mid-sentence. Coffee cups hovered in mid-air. She smiled, thinly. Forced. "Children exaggerate," she said lightly, brushing an invisible speck from her jacket, "especially certain children." Nobody said anything, nobody agreed. They just sipped their coffee quietly, eyes flickering everywhere but her face. The silence told her everything. Meanwhile, Jaden sat alone under the oldest oak tree in the courtyard, the golden afternoon light falling across his open sketch pad. He wasn't drawing, he wasn't reading. He was just waiting because he knew. He could feel it. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. Across the courtyard, Principal Dalton stood inside his office, blinds half closed, phone pressed tightly. To his ear, "Yes, Mr. Carter," he said, voice oozing sudden respect. "Of course, Mr. Carter, we'll handle this with the utmost discretion." His hands trembled as he hung up the call. He knew the Carter name. Everyone in the state did, and now Brentwood Academy was standing on the edge of a blade, balanced on the thin, dangerous line between arrogance and survival. The letter arrived before the final bell. It was hand-delivered, a crisp, cream-colored envelope with the Brentwood Academy seal embossed in gold. Principal Dalton's signature curled across the bottom, trying too hard to look casual. Jaden unfolded it slowly, right there in front of everyone. "Dear Mr. Carter," it read, "we invite you and your family to a private meeting regarding your educational journey at Brentwood Academy. We deeply value diversity and excellence within our community." He almost laughed. The word diversity had never touched these marble floors until now. Not really. Jaden folded the letter neatly and tucked it back into his pocket. Across the room, Mrs. Whitmore watched, her face a mask of strained politeness. Her nails tapped a restless rhythm against her desk. Tap, tap, tap. The walls around her world were closing in. She had sent her own email to the administration earlier that afternoon, filled with justifications and carefully edited facts. He misunderstood. I was guiding him. Perhaps he feels uncomfortable here for unrelated reasons. Excuses wrapped in politeness, the same old armor. But even as she hit send, she knew it wouldn't be enough. Jaden rose when the bell rang, slow and deliberate. Didn't rush, he didn't flinch. He moved through the throng of students like a shadow passing through light, silent but impossible to ignore. Mrs. Whitmore called after him, forcing a smile. "Jaden, dear, a word." He stopped, but didn't turn. The air between them tightened, stretched to breaking. "I hope you understand," she said, her voice pitched low so no one else could hear. "It's important to fit in, to not make things harder for yourself." Jaden finally turned his head, just slightly. The look he gave her wasn't anger. It wasn't sadness. It was something colder. "I'm not the one who's about to have a hard time," he said quietly. And with that, he walked away. The courtyard buzzed as students gathered in small, gossiping huddles, stealing glances at him. He could hear snatches of conversation. "Meeting with the board? His dad's like crazy rich. Mrs. Whitmore's toast." Jaden sat again beneath the old oak tree, the same tree whose roots had twisted and torn the earth over decades. Resilient, unbending. He opened his sketchpad, drawing slow, deliberate lines across the page. It wasn't a picture, it was a blueprint, a plan. Across campus, Principal Dalton wiped sweat from his forehead and braced himself. Tomorrow's meeting wasn't going to be a discussion. It was going to be a reckoning, and Brentwood Academy wasn't ready. Not even close. The conference room smelled like fresh leather and desperation. Principal Dalton had ordered everything perfect. Gleaming mahogany table, imported bottled water, a tray of expensive pastries no one would touch. A photo of Brentwood's founding fathers, 4 grim white men in 19th century suits, loomed on the wall behind him. Jaden entered first. He wore a tailored blazer now, darker, sharper. The students who had whispered behind his back earlier now kept their distance, as if he carried a contagious kind of power. Behind him walked Mr. Carter. The room seemed to shrink the moment he stepped inside. Thomas Carter was a man of tall, quiet authority. No flashy jewelry, no loud voice, no bodyguards. Just a dark grey suit, a steel wristwatch, and an aura of absolute command. The head of Brentwood's board, Mrs. Langston, rose quickly to greet him. "Mr. Carter," she smiled, voice trembling slightly. What an honor! Thomas Carter smiled back, polite but cold. The honor, he said evenly, depends on how this meeting goes. Mrs. Whitmore sat near the window, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Sweat dotted her hairline despite the air conditioning. "Let's begin," Principal Dalton said, voice too bright. He launched into a carefully worded apology, a symphony of buzzwords: misunderstanding, diversity, unfortunate incident, lessons learned. Jaden sat motionless. Thomas Carter listened without interruption, but his eyes scanned the room like a hawk tracking prey. When Dalton finally finished, Mrs. Langston leaned forward eagerly. "We believe," she said, clasping her manicured hands, "that this can be handled internally, quietly, respectfully. No need for unnecessary escalation." The word escalation hung in the air like a warning shot. Thomas Carter chuckled softly. "It was not a friendly sound. You assume," he said slowly, "that my concern is about public embarrassment." Mrs. Whitmore swallowed visibly. "It isn't," Carter continued. "My concern is about precedent, about accountability, about making sure that no other black child or any child walks into this building and feels like their presence is a mistake." The silence was deafening. Mrs. Langston blinked rapidly, trying to recover. Of course. We'll be launching a full diversity initiative, sensitivity training. Scholarships! Not enough," Carter cut her off smoothly. He turned slightly toward Jaden. "Son, would you like to tell them your conditions?" Jaden didn't hesitate. "I want Mrs. Whitmore suspended pending investigation," he said, voice clear and steady. "I want a public apology issued to the entire student body. I want a full audit of the Academy's hiring and disciplinary practices over the last 10 years. And I want minority scholarships expanded by 300%, funded personally by the board." Mrs. Whitmore's mouth opened and closed like a dying fish. Principal Dalton looked like he might faint. Mrs. Langston forced a tight smile. "Those are ambitious demands. They're non-negotiable," Thomas Carter said. "And if they're not met, my lawyers will file a federal discrimination lawsuit by the end of the week." He leaned back in his chair, completely at ease. "Brentwood Academy will be the headline. Not just here, nationwide." Dalton dropped his pen. Mrs. Whitmore clutched the edge of her seat. Jaden sat still, watching. This was not revenge. This was correction. This was legacy. Mrs. Langston hesitated, then nodded once, stiffly. We'll prepare a formal proposal," she said. "You'll have 24 hours, Carter replied. "Not a minute more." He rose smoothly to his feet, his presence filling the room. Jaden followed, and as they exited, Jaden allowed himself one last glance back at Mrs. Whitmore, her face pale, her world crumbling. She looked so small now, so powerless. Jaden didn't smile. He didn't need to. The storm had already begun, and Brentwood Academy would never be the same. The email arrived that morning, flooding every inbox in Brentwood Academy with a forced kind of urgency. Mandatory assembly, 11:00 a.m., school gymnasium, attendance required. Students glanced at each other in the hallways, wide-eyed. Teachers whispered behind closed doors. The air around the marble pillars felt heavier, as if the building itself knew something ugly was about to be painted over, with a glossy corporate sheen. Jaden read the email once, smiled slightly, and slipped his phone back into his pocket. He knew they weren't apologizing because they were sorry. They were apologizing because they were afraid. The gymnasium, usually echoing with the sound of bouncing basketballs and shouted encouragements, now sat in tense silence. Rows of metal chairs lined the polished floor. A long table covered in a velvet cloth stood at the front, with Principal Dalton, Mrs. Langston, and the entire administrative board seated stiffly behind it. And at the far edge, trying desperately not to draw attention to herself, sat Mrs. Whitmore. Jaden entered through the back doors, his backpack slung casually over one shoulder, his face unreadable. Students nudged each other as he passed. Some whispered, others simply stared. He wasn't just another student anymore. He was something more now. He took a seat near the middle, just close enough to see every flinch, every forced smile, every silent tremor. Principal Dalton cleared his throat into the microphone, the sound booming uncomfortably loud. "Good morning, Brentwood Academy," he began, his voice strained. "We are gathered here today to acknowledge an unfortunate event and to reaffirm our commitment to fostering an environment of inclusion, dignity, and mutual respect." Jaden's fingers drummed, lightly against his knee, calm but restless. The principal's words flowed smoothly, clearly rehearsed. Words like regret and unintentional harm and moving forward together filled the cavernous gym, each syllable dripping with careful neutrality. Not a single real apology, not a single direct mention of what had been said or who had said it. Cowardice. Dressed up in pretty vocabulary. Finally, Mrs. Langston stood. "We would now like to invite Mrs. Whitmore to say a few words," she announced, her voice carrying a thin veneer of authority. Every head in the gym turned. Mrs. Whitmore rose slowly, her expression blank, almost ghost-like. She clutched a sheet of paper with both hands, the edges trembling slightly. She stepped up to the microphone, and for a moment, just a moment, Jaden thought she might tell the truth, that she might break free from the chains of arrogance and say something real. But she didn't. Instead, she read from the paper in a flat, rehearsed tone. "I deeply regret any misunderstanding that occurred. It was never my intention to create an environment of discomfort. I am committed to learning and growing alongside all members of our community." The words echoed hollowly. No ownership, no acknowledgement, no real shame. Jaden leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. Around him, students shifted uncomfortably. Some shook their heads. Others looked down at their laps. A few stole quick glances at Jaden, almost apologetic. When Mrs. Whitmore finished, there was no applause, just silence. Principal Dalton quickly stepped back up, trying to salvage the moment. "We thank Mrs. Whitmore for her words," he said. "And now, in the spirit of unity, we will be launching several new initiatives aimed at celebrating diversity and fostering understanding." Jaden heard it all. Workshops, committees, outreach programs, paper shields against the reality no one wanted to confront. When the assembly finally ended, students filed out in uneasy silence. A few murmured polite phrases about change. Others walked quickly, eager to escape the tension hanging in the air. Jaden didn't move. He sat still as a stone until the gym was almost empty. Mrs. Whitmore passed near him on her way out, clutching, her bag tight against her side. Their eyes met. Just for a second, there was no anger in Jaden's gaze, no gloating, no triumph, only quiet, merciless disappointment. Mrs. Whitmore flinched first, looking away. Outside, the autumn wind tore through the empty courtyard, sending dead leaves skittering across the stone. The banners hanging from the flagpoles snapped sharply in the breeze, bright against the grey sky. Jaden finally rose, sliding his backpack over his shoulder. He wasn't naive. He knew change wouldn't come from one speech or one meeting. But seeds had been planted. Eyes had been opened, and sometimes the slow crumble of an empire started with a whisper instead of a roar. As he stepped into the cold afternoon light, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. It started at the breakfast tables. Mothers sipping almond milk lattes leaned closer, whispering over the rustle of newspapers and the tapping of iPads. "Did you hear? His father's Thomas Carter." "You mean the Thomas Carter? The richest man in the state, maybe the whole region." By the time the sun had climbed fully over Brentwood Academy's gleaming spires, the shift was tangible. It moved through the parking lot, past the rows of sleek black SUVs and luxury sedans, through the front gates, into every marble corridor. It buzzed between locker doors and study halls, rippling across campus like a silent, unstoppable wave. Students who had once sneered behind Jaden's back now lowered their gazes respectfully when he passed. Some offered thin, nervous smiles. Others simply stepped aside without needing to be asked. Jaden didn't acknowledge them. He didn't need to. The power had already changed hands. It wasn't brute force. It wasn't loud. It was quiet. It was relentless. It was absolute. Meanwhile, Mrs. Whitmore felt the ground crumbling under her heels. Her colleagues, once casual, friendly, now avoided lingering too long near her in the teacher's lounge. Invitations to planning committees mysteriously dried up. At lunch, she found herself sitting alone at the far end of the faculty table, her email inbox filled with administrative reviews of her classroom performance. Her phone calls were returned slower. Her smiles were met with tight nods. She could feel herself becoming radioactive. Her mind raced through late nights and restless dawns, scrambling for a way back into favor. Maybe if she apologized again? Maybe if she found a way to spin it differently? But deep down, she knew. No apology could fix what had been exposed. It wasn't just about Jaden anymore. It was about the rot inside Brentwood that could no longer be ignored, and she had become the perfect symbol of it. In the Carter estate, a sprawling glass and stone fortress on the edge of the city, Jaden sat on the balcony overlooking the gardens, his homework untouched beside him. The evening air smelled of jasmine and the distant salt of the ocean. The city lights blinked far below, tiny and meaningless. Thomas Carter joined him silently, carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. He handed one to Jaden and sat across from him. "You handled yourself well," Thomas said, his voice low. Jaden shrugged, tracing a line of condensation down the side of his glass. "It's not over," he said. "No," Thomas agreed. "It isn't." For a moment they sat in silence, the only sound the distant murmur of waves and the occasional call of night birds. "Are you angry?" Thomas asked finally. Jaden thought about it, really thought. "I was," he admitted, "at first." "And now?" Jaden sipped his tea, considering. "Now I'm just disappointed. Not surprised. Just disappointed." Thomas smiled. "A small, sad thing. That's how it starts," he said. "Change doesn't come from anger. It comes from disappointment so deep it can't be ignored anymore." Jaden looked out over the glittering city, his heart heavy but steady. "They're scared," he said quietly. "I can feel it." "They should be," Thomas replied, his tone sharpening. He leaned forward, fixing Jaden with a look of intense focus. "You have power now, Jaden, real power, not because of money, not because of my name. Because you showed them they can't break you, because you held your ground when it would have been easier to bow." Jaden nodded slowly. "I'm not done," he said. Thomas smiled again, not sad this time, but proud. "Good," he said. The next morning, Mrs. Whitmore found a new note slipped under her classroom door. It wasn't from a student, it wasn't from a colleague, it was from the board. "Mandatory review meeting. Friday, 4 p.m., Administration Building." She crumpled the paper in her hand, her nails biting into her palm. Students barely looked at her anymore. Parents had started to pull their children from her classes, requesting reassignment to other teachers. The whispers had grown louder. "She's a liability. Bad for the school's image. Not worth the trouble." Mrs. Whitmore sat at her desk, long after the final bell rang, staring out the window at the falling leaves. Outside, Jaden passed by, walking with slow, deliberate steps. He didn't glance up. He didn't need to. He had already won, and Mrs. Whitmore, once the queen of Brentwood Academy's ivory towers, now sat trapped inside her crumbling kingdom, powerless to stop the collapse. The ground beneath her had shifted, and there was no going back. The news broke on a sleepy Thursday afternoon. At first, it was just a whisper on social media, a blurry photo of the apology assembly, posted without context. But then someone shared a clip, 30 seconds of shaky cell. Phone footage capturing Mrs. Whitmore's hollow apology and the tense silence that followed. 30 seconds that spread like wildfire. By nightfall, local news stations were picking it up. By morning, it was everywhere. Elite private academy accused of racism against student. Top donor's son humiliated by staff. Demands action. Old money, old problems. Brentwood Academy under fire. Jaden's phone buzzed non-stop, flooding with messages. Some were supportive, some were curious, a few were venomous. He ignored them all. He sat at the kitchen counter of the Carter estate, calmly eating a bowl of cereal, while the morning news droned on in the background. Across the Marble Island, Thomas Carter sipped his coffee, his tablet buzzing with emails from lawyers and board members. Neither of them looked particularly surprised. "You okay?" Thomas asked without looking up. Jaden shrugged, spooning another mouthful of cereal. "I'm fine." And he was. The fury he might have felt once was long gone. Now there was only clarity and patience, because this wasn't about making noise, it was about making change. At Brentwood Academy, the mood had shifted from tense to chaotic. Parents flooded the administrative offices with phone calls demanding answers. Alumni threatened to withdraw donations. Sponsors started pulling scheduled events. The school's brand, pristine, elite, untouchable, now carried a permanent stain, and nobody was more acutely aware of it than Principal Dalton. He paced behind his desk, running a shaking hand through his thinning hair as he barked orders at his assistant. "Draft a second apology. No, a better one. Find a PR firm. Hell, find 3. Set up diversity panels. Get photos, smiling kids, multicultural stuff. Post it everywhere." "But sir," his assistant stammered, "what about Mrs. Whitmore?" Dalton stopped pacing. The name hung in the air like a bad smell. He sighed heavily. "She's a liability now," he said quietly. "We'll have to cut her loose. But she's been here for—" "I know how long she's been here," Dalton snapped, "and it doesn't matter anymore." Self-preservation over loyalty. It was the Brentwood way. Mrs. Whitmore sat alone in her classroom, staring at the walls she had once decorated with so much pride. Her inbox was flooded too, but not with support. Parents demanding she be fired. Former students expressing disappointment. Strangers sending hate mail. She scrolled numbly through the messages, each one cutting deeper than the last. She had tried to convince herself it would blow over. It always had before. A small scandal. A few awkward days, and then back to business as usual. But this time was different. This time the target wasn't just her. It was the system that had protected her for decades, and now that system was abandoning her to save itself. Her hands trembled as she closed her laptop. A knock at the door startled her. Principal Dalton entered without waiting for a response. His face was grim, hollow. "We need to talk," he said. Mrs. Whitmore stood slowly, her heart hammering. She already knew. "You're letting me go," she said flatly. Dalton hesitated, then nodded. "You can resign quietly, with severance," he offered. "Or we can terminate for cause. Your choice." The words landed like blows. After 30 years, after countless hours, after shaping the very culture of Brentwood Academy, cast aside like garbage, she sank back into her chair, numb. "I'll resign," she whispered. Dalton nodded, already turning away. Business concluded. Humanity optional. Jaden heard the news that afternoon, sitting under the same old oak tree where it had all begun. The whispers reached him before the official announcement. "She's gone." Forced to resign? Bet she didn't see that coming. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He just closed his sketchpad quietly and rose to his feet. Change wasn't a victory parade. It was slow, heavy, and often thankless, but it was happening, step by step, brick by crumbling brick. As he walked across the courtyard, the autumn wind tugged at the edges of his jacket. The leaves spun wildly across the stones, and Brentwood Academy, once so cold and untouchable, suddenly seemed smaller, not defeated, not yet, but no longer invincible. Not anymore. And Jaden Carter wasn't done, not even close. By Monday, the story was no longer just a trending topic. It was a movement. Local news trucks parked outside Brentwood Academy's stone gates. Their satellite dishes pointed skyward like mechanical flowers. Journalists camped on the sidewalks, interviewing anyone who would talk. Students, parents, even the janitorial staff. Activist groups showed up next, carrying colorful signs and chanting slogans. Education without discrimination. Brentwood must change. Accountability now. The headmaster had ordered new security guards at the entrances, but even they seemed unsure whether they were protecting the students or keeping the truth locked. Inside the main building, Principal Dalton's office became a war room. He huddled with lawyers, PR consultants, and frantic board members, spinning strategies like desperate spiders. Release a diversity initiative. Highlight our scholarship. Programs. Invite a guest speaker, someone famous, someone black. But no matter how fast they moved, they were always a step behind the storm, because the storm wasn't wild. It was calculated, and Jaden was at the center of it. Sitting at the corner booth of a quiet coffee shop downtown, Jaden sipped his hot chocolate while Layla Evans, a local journalist, set up her recorder. She was young, sharp-eyed, and known for uncovering the kind of stories bigger outlets preferred to bury. "I appreciate you meeting with me," Layla said. Jaden nodded, calm. "I don't want pity," he said. "I don't want token changes." He leaned forward, his voice steady. "I want structures to collapse. I want the people who built them to answer for what they've created." Layla smiled slowly, tapping the record button. "You're not here to burn it all down," she said. "You're here to rebuild." Jaden nodded once. Exactly. For the next hour he told her everything. The insult, the humiliation, the rot hiding beneath Brentwood's polished marble, not with anger, not with rage, with clarity, with undeniable, unshakable truth. When the interview ended, Layla stood, shaking his hand firmly. "You're about to change everything," she said. Jaden didn't smile. He didn't need to. The next morning, Layla's article dropped online. Inside Brentwood Academy, racism, silence, and a student who refused to bow. It spread faster than even the original video. Parents read it, alumni read it, investors read it, and the donors, the lifeblood of Brentwood Academy's gleaming halls, started pulling out, one by one. By the end of the week, the school's operating fund had shrunk by 15%. Principal Dalton stared at the reports in disbelief. "This isn't just a scandal anymore," his lawyer said grimly. "It's an indictment." Dalton rubbed his temples, feeling the crushing weight of decades of arrogance finally folding inwards. "We have to meet with the Carters," Dalton muttered. "We have to make this right," the lawyer sighed. "It might be too late for that." Meanwhile, in a sunlit boardroom overlooking the city skyline, Thomas Carter smiled coolly at the room full of reporters. Jaden sat beside him, silent but powerful. "Brentwood Academy is an institution rooted in history," Thomas said into the sea of microphones. "But history, unchallenged, becomes rot." He let the words hang in the air. "My son faced public humiliation at an institution our family has supported for decades. We will no longer remain silent." He outlined demands: independent investigations, public oversight, a new board composed of diverse leaders. The reporters scribbled frantically, recording every word. "And if they refuse?" one reporter asked. Thomas smiled again, slow and dangerous. Then Brentwood Academy will become a cautionary tale, and we'll build something better in its ashes. Jaden leaned forward then, speaking for the first time. Change is coming, he said simply, whether they invite it or not. The room exploded in flashes and shouted questions, but Jaden stood, his message already delivered. He and his father exited together, leaving a storm behind them. Back at Brentwood, whispers turned into outright panic. Students debated fiercely in classrooms and cafeterias. Did you read the article? They're finished if they don't fix this. I heard they're firing half the staff. Teachers clung to their jobs, desperate to prove their innocence by association. Mrs. Whitmore, now officially resigned, had disappeared from public view entirely. Some said she fled the state, others whispered she was preparing to sue for wrongful dismissal. But nobody cared. Nobody defended her anymore. The old power structures had collapsed, and no one wanted to be caught in the rubble. Jaden returned to school the following week, walking slowly up the main steps. The banners had changed. Where once there were posters celebrating tradition and excellence, now there were new ones: inclusion, diversity, respect. It was performative, sure, surface level. But it was something a beginning. Students nodded respectfully as he passed. Some muttered quick hellos. Others simply moved out of his way, instinctively recognizing a new kind of authority. Inside the front lobby, a new plaque had been mounted on the marble wall. It read, "Brentwood Academy acknowledges its history and commits to a future of true equality, justice, and respect for all students." Below it, a quote, "Silence in the face of injustice is complicity." Jaden stared at it for a long moment, not in pride, not in triumph, in sober, quiet understanding. Change didn't erase the past, but it shaped the future, and the future was already unfolding. That afternoon, as Jaden sat beneath the old oak tree once more, sketchpad in his lap, he started a new drawing. Not a blueprint, not a plan, a vision, a school that could belong to everyone. A community built on more than marble and old money. A place where no child would ever feel like a mistake again. He sketched late into the golden evening, the leaves swirling around him like blessings. And as the sun dipped behind the hills, Jaden Carter smiled for the first time in weeks. Not because it was over, but because it was only just beginning. The cracks in Brentwood's perfect facade had become impossible to ignore. Every hallway conversation now split into two camps: those who believed change was necessary and long overdue, and those who clung bitterly to the old ways. It wasn't just students, it was teachers, administrators, parents. The invisible lines of division that had always existed were now painfully visible. Jaden walked through the center of it, a silent witness to the slow, inevitable fracture. Some students nodded at him respectfully, new allies who saw him not as a threat, but as a catalyst. Others glared when they thought he wasn't looking, their resentment barely hidden. "You ruined this place," he overheard once, whispered behind his back. He didn't flinch, he didn't react. He knew better now. When structures built on inequality begin to crumble, the first reaction isn't always gratitude. Sometimes it's rage. Sometimes it's fear, but mostly it's desperation. Meanwhile, Brentwood's board scrambled to manage the PR nightmare. They announced sweeping new policies: mandatory diversity training, anonymous reporting channels, scholarships funded by board members' own pockets. They invited prominent civil rights leaders to speak at assemblies. They printed glossy brochures filled with stock photos of smiling, diverse students. But for every step forward, they stumbled. Twice. Because change crafted out of fear, not conviction, is always fragile, and Jaden Carter wasn't interested in fragile promises. He wanted permanence. In the cafeteria, a new incident simmered. A small group of students, ones Jaden recognized as loyal to Brentwood's old guard, had started gathering near the windows, sneering and muttering when black or minority students passed. No outright slurs, no violence, just poison, slow and insidious. Jaden noticed immediately. He watched, listened, and then he acted, without raising his voice, without making a scene. He approached quietly one afternoon, standing at the edge of their table. The ringleader, a stocky boy named Bryce with a smug grin, leaned back in his chair. "Something you need, Carter," he drawled. Jaden didn't blink. He simply set a single piece of paper on the table, a printed copy of Brentwood's new zero-tolerance discrimination policy, signed by the board, publicly posted, legally binding. He tapped the bottom line with one finger. "Smile for the cameras," Jaden said softly, and then he walked away, leaving them pale and furious behind him. The next morning, Bryce and 2 others were called to the dean's office. By noon, they were suspended pending investigation. Change wasn't just policy now, it had teeth. At home that evening, Jaden sat in his room, staring at the city skyline glowing in the twilight. His phone buzzed with a message from Mia, a friend he had known since elementary school, one of the few who had never treated him differently. "Mia, proud of you. You're doing what they said couldn't be done." He smiled slightly, but beneath the pride, a new weight settled. Responsibility, expectation, pressure. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for every student who had ever been. Made to feel small, invisible, unworthy, and that fight didn't end with one policy change. It was a war, long, exhausting, necessary. The next day, Jaden found a note slipped into his locker. No name, just a folded piece of notebook paper scrawled, in messy handwriting, "Careful who you trust. Not everyone wants things to change." He read it twice. No threats, no accusations, just a warning. He tucked it into his pocket without reaction, because deep down, he already knew Brentwood was changing. But not everyone would survive that change gracefully. Some would fight tooth and nail to drag it back into darkness, and Jaden would have to decide how far he was willing to go, how much he was willing to lose, and what or who he was willing to protect. In the weeks that followed, small victories piled up. A racist teacher retired early. Student-led diversity council was formed, with Jaden quietly advising from behind the scenes. The old banners celebrating tradition were replaced with new murals painted by students of all backgrounds. For the first time, the school yearbook would feature a cover designed by minority students, breaking a 20-year tradition of white-only editorial teams. They were small things, symbols, but symbols mattered. Symbols inspired action. Action created momentum, and momentum created change, real, lasting change. But for every step forward, shadows lingered. Late-night graffiti sprayed on the outer walls, anonymous. Hate messages slipped into lockers. Rumors whispered about taking Brentwood back. It was a reminder. Victories had to be defended, progress had to be protected, and Jaden wasn't naive enough to think his journey was anywhere near finished. He stood beneath the oak tree one crisp afternoon, sketching again. Not buildings this time, people, faces, names, students who had been overlooked, ignored, silenced. He was building an invisible army, one that didn't fight with fists, but with unity, with courage, with refusal. He wasn't alone anymore, and he never would be again. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the courtyard, Jaden closed his sketchbook and smiled quietly. Change was messy, change was painful, but change was happening, and for the first time, Brentwood Academy belonged to everyone, not just the few who had built it on exclusion and silence, not just the old names carved into its marble walls, but the new ones, 2. The ones who refused to be erased, the ones who refused to bow, the ones who were finally standing tall, and Jaden Carter was leading the way. It began with a single flyer taped to a hallway bulletin board, simple black and white letters, Brentwood. Students for Real Change. Open meeting today, 4 p.m. courtyard. No names, no logos, no permission slips, just a statement. A summons. Jaden saw it between classes, his heart beating a little faster. He hadn't printed it. He hadn't planned it. But someone else had. Someone who had seen what he'd started and wanted to carry it further. By the end of the day, flyers covered every available surface, lockers, doors, benches. Teachers ripped them down. Administrators warned students to focus on studies. But the flyers kept multiplying, faster than they could be erased. A quiet rebellion. At exactly 4 o'clock, Jaden walked into the courtyard and paused. Hundreds of students waited, not just the ones who had nodded at him respectfully before. Not just the minority students, everyone, athletes, honor students, freshmen, seniors, different colors, different backgrounds, all standing together. A buzz filled the air, nervous, electric. Mia spotted him first and waved him forward, her smile wide and proud. "You come into the front?" she called. Jaden hesitated. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't planned this, but maybe that was the point. He moved forward slowly, students parting around him. At the makeshift stage, a stack of old gym mats, Mia handed him a microphone. He stared at it for a second, feeling the weight of it. Not fear, not pressure, responsibility. He stepped up onto the mats and raised the mic to his lips. The courtyard fell silent. Jaden took a breath and spoke. "I didn't start this," he said, voice steady, "and I can't finish it alone." He looked out at the sea of faces, some scared, some fierce, all watching him with desperate hope. "But together," he continued, "we can make sure Brentwood becomes the place it pretends to be. Not just for us, for everyone who comes after us." A ripple of energy moved through the crowd. "We're not asking for permission anymore," Jaden said, his voice rising. "We're claiming our right to belong." A roar of approval erupted. Students stomped their feet, clapped their hands, chanted, "Change! Change! Change!" Jaden lowered the mic, heart thundering in his chest. Not fear, not pride, purpose. By the next morning, the protest had made headlines. Students demand real reform at Brentwood Academy. Youth movement shakes elite schools' foundations. Principal Dalton called an emergency meeting with the student council, hoping to regain control. He offered listening sessions. He promised open dialogues. He tried, desperately, to co-opt the movement. Jaden and the others refused. They demanded a formal seat at the table, real student representation on the school's board. Dalton balked. "Students aren't ready for that kind of responsibility," he said. Mia smiled sweetly. "Maybe we should have a press conference and ask the community what they think." Dalton paled, and the board caved. A week later, Brentwood Academy announced a historic decision. 2 student representatives, elected by their peers, would now sit on the Academy's Board of Governors with full voting rights. It wasn't a complete revolution, but it was a crack, a beginning, and cracks, Jaden knew, could shatter empires. Not everyone celebrated. Anonymous hate messages continued to pop up on student forums. A Save Our Tradition club formed, trying to paint the protesters as troublemakers and outsiders. Jaden wasn't surprised. Power never surrenders quietly. It clings, it scratches, it tries to rot you from the inside, but he didn't let it, because for every voice of hate, there were 10 voices of hope rising louder, voices that had once been too scared to speak, now shouting, now demanding, now refusing to be invisible. In late October, Brentwood held its annual Fall Festival. a decades-old tradition usually reserved for wealthy parents and alumni parading their status. This year, it looked different. Student art lined the courtyard, showcasing the diverse histories and dreams of the student body. A food fair offered dishes from dozens of cultures. Poetry readings, dance performances, musical acts filled the air with color and sound. For the first time, it felt like Brentwood belonged to everyone, not just the old names carved into stone. New names, new faces, new futures. Jaden stood at the edge of the crowd, soaking it all in. Mia nudged him with her shoulder. "You realize you did this, right?" she teased. Jaden shook his head. "No," he said, "we did." She grinned. "But you lit the match." He smiled back, a small, real smile. Maybe he had. Maybe lighting the match had been the easy part. Keeping the fire alive, that would be the real challenge. But looking at the students laughing, dancing, living without fear, he knew it was possible. More than possible. It was already happening, and it would keep happening, as long as they stood together. As long as they refused to go back. As long as they kept rising. Because change wasn't a moment, it was a movement, and Jaden Carter was proud to be part of it. It happened on a Tuesday. Grey skies loomed over Brentwood Academy, the clouds heavy with unshed rain. The courtyard buzzed, with the usual noise, laughter, arguments, scattered footfalls, but underneath it a low tension crackled. Jaden felt it before he saw it, eyes darting toward him, whispers spreading faster than wildfire. He slowed his pace, scanning the crowd. Then he saw it, a massive banner draped across the front of the main building, flapping in the cold wind. "Brentwood for Brentwood, no outsiders." The words were painted in thick red letters, sloppy and aggressive. Jaden froze, heart hammering in his chest. Students gathered around, staring in shock. Some laughed nervously, some turned away, some looked at him with wide, guilty eyes. Mia pushed through the crowd and reached his side, her face flushed with anger. "Who did this?" she demanded. Jaden didn't answer. He didn't need to. Bryce. And the others. The ones who had been suspended and now had nothing left to lose. A deliberate public strike. A warning. You don't belong here. You never did. Jaden's fists clenched at his sides, not in fear, in fury, but he forced himself to breathe. To think. Because that's what they wanted, for him to lash out, to lose control, to prove every ugly stereotype they whispered behind closed doors. He wouldn't give them that satisfaction. Instead, he stepped forward, walked straight up to the banner, tore it down with one smooth, brutal yank. The fabric ripped with a satisfying sound, fluttering to the ground at his feet. He turned slowly, facing the crowd. Hundreds of students watched, waiting, silent. Jaden held up the shredded banner, for everyone to see. "This," he said loudly, voice carrying across the courtyard, "is not Brentwood." He dropped the torn fabric onto the marble steps, and it never will be again. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then, one student clapped, then another, and another. Until the courtyard erupted into applause and cheers. Jaden stood still, letting it wash over him, letting the shame fall where it belonged, not on him, but on the cowards who still clung to a dying past. By lunch, the video had gone viral, another cell phone clip, another proof that change couldn't be stopped. Brentwood. Student shuts down hate speech with one move. Courage in action, the new face of Brentwood. Donations surged from unexpected sources. Civil rights organizations released statements of support. A famous musician even offered to fund a full scholarship program under Jaden's name. The tide was no longer just shifting, it was roaring forward, and Brentwood Academy had no choice but to move with it or drown. Behind closed doors, Bryce and his followers were disciplined swiftly, expelled publicly, no secrecy, no cover-ups. The administration knew better now. They had learned the hard way that silence was its own kind of complicity. Principal Dalton personally called Jaden into his office that afternoon. He rose when Jaden entered, offering a stiff handshake. "I owe you an apology," Dalton said, voice rough. Jaden looked him in the eye. "No," he said, "you owe the students an apology." Dalton hesitated, then nodded. "You're right." And for once, just once, Jaden believed he meant it. Outside, the campus was alive with change. Students painted new murals over the walls, once marked by hate. Teachers incorporated lessons about civil rights, history, and systemic injustice into their curriculums. Counselors hosted open forums where students could share their experiences without fear. And everywhere Jaden looked, he saw it, the cracks in Brentwood's perfect walls, widening, not destroying the school, rebuilding it, making it stronger, fairer, real. One evening, Thomas Carter invited Jaden to the rooftop garden of their estate. They stood side by side, watching the sun sink into the horizon, setting the sky ablaze with gold and crimson. "You made me proud," Thomas said quietly. Jaden smiled faintly. "I didn't do it alone," Thomas nodded, approving. "That's the real mark of a leader." They fell into a comfortable silence, broken only by the soft hum of the city below. After a while, Thomas spoke again. "What's next?" Jaden thought about it. He could go to college. He could leave Brentwood behind forever. He could forget it all, the battles, the scars, the victories, or... "I stay," he said. Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Stay," Jaden nodded, "until the work is done." Thomas smiled, slow and proud. "Then let's get to work." The next morning, Jaden submitted his application to run for student body president, not because he wanted a title, not because he needed recognition, but because real change needed roots, and he intended to plant them deep. Mia threw her arms around him when she heard. "You're gonna crush it," she grinned. Jaden laughed, the sound light and rare. "We're gonna crush it," he corrected, because this wasn't just about him. It never had been. It was about every voice that had been silenced, every dream that had been deferred, every child who had been told they didn't belong. Brentwood had tried to break him. Instead, he had broken Brentwood open, and he wasn't done yet. Not even close. The auditorium hummed with anticipation. Parents fanned themselves with shiny programs. Teachers lined the back walls, their faces a mixture of pride and exhaustion. Students in navy blue gowns fidgeted in their seats, tassels swinging nervously from their caps. Jaden Carter sat among them, his cap balanced carefully on his head, the heavy velvet sash of student body president draped across his shoulders. He hadn't run for the title to prove anything. He had run to protect the momentum, to make sure the change they fought for didn't die the moment they crossed that stage. And somehow, against everything, he had won by a landslide. He adjusted the edge of his cap, his gaze sweeping across the sea of faces, familiar, strange, new. He spotted Mia a few rows over, flashing him a wide, thumbs-up grin. Beyond her, teachers who once doubted him now nodded with genuine respect. Even Principal Dalton, standing stiffly near the podium, caught his eye and gave a small, almost apologetic smile. The ceremony droned on. Awards, speeches, formalities. Jaden barely heard them. His heart beat steadily in his chest, carrying him forward toward the moment he wasn't sure he had ever dared to dream about. Finally, the principal tapped the microphone. "And now," Dalton announced, "your elected student body president, Jaden Carter, will deliver the graduation address." Applause erupted. Jaden rose slowly, walking toward the stage. He didn't clutch his speech in shaking hands. He didn't read from note cards. He spoke from memory, from heart. "Good afternoon," Jaden began, voice strong. The crowd hushed instantly. "We stand here today, not just as individuals, but as a community." He let the words settle before continuing. "A community that has faced hard truths. A community that has fought and is still fighting to be better than the past it inherited." He paused, scanning the room. And today isn't just about celebrating where we are, it's about committing to where we're going. He took a deep breath. I look around and I see more than classmates. I see dreamers, builders, fighters, healers. Another beat of silence. We have torn down walls built to divide us. We have planted seeds where once there was only stone. And those seeds are courage. Our unity, our refusal to be silent, will grow into something bigger than any of us. Jaden's voice softened. I'm proud to have been a part of it. I'm proud of every single one of you who stood when it was easier to sit, who spoke when it was safer to stay silent. He smiled slightly, letting the emotion rise but not drown him. This is not the end. He lifted his chin. This is the beginning. Applause thundered through the hall, rolling over him like a wave. He stepped back from the podium, heart pounding but steady, unbreakable. After the ceremony, the courtyard filled. With laughter, hugs, and tearful goodbyes, Jaden stood with Mia, their gowns fluttering in the breeze, their arms full of flowers and congratulations. You killed it up there, Mia said, grinning. Jaden laughed. I didn't trip, so success. She punched his arm lightly. No, seriously. You changed this place. He shook his head. We changed it. And it was true. Change hadn't come because one person stood alone. It had come because enough people decided enough was enough, because silence had become unbearable, because injustice had become undeniable, because courage had finally outweighed fear. Thomas Carter found him near the old oak tree, the same tree where it had all started. He handed Jaden a small black box. Open it, Thomas said. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, was a silver medallion. On one side, Brentwood's traditional crest. On the other, a new engraving, a single word. Legacy. Jaden swallowed hard. You earned it, Thomas said simply. Not because of wealth, not because of blood, because he had dared to stand, because he had refused to bow, because he had built something that would outlive him. As the sun dipped low, Jaden wandered the campus one last time, past the murals, past the classrooms, past the steps where he had once been told he didn't belong. Every stone bore silent witness to what had been changed. Every shadow hinted at battles still to be fought. He didn't pretend it was perfect now. He knew better, but it was better, and it would keep getting better, because the next class, and the one after that, would inherit more than marble and money. They would inherit a blueprint, a memory, a fire that could not be snuffed out. At the edge of the field, where the wind stirred the tall grass, Jaden paused. He turned one last time to look at Brentwood Academy, not with bitterness, not with regret, but with a quiet, powerful pride. They tried to humiliate him, they tried to erase him, they tried to make him small. Instead, he had forced them to see, to change, to rise, and now it was time to move forward, not away, but ahead, carrying everything he had fought for, and everyone who had fought beside him, into whatever came next. The future wasn't written yet, but for the first time, it would be written by all of them, together. Jaden. Carter slipped the silver medallion into his pocket, the word legacy warm against his palm. He squared his shoulders, and he walked into the setting sun, unbroken, unbowed, unstoppable.